Hi everybody, this is Delaney Cyphers. I'm doing my mini lecture on Riparian ecology. So before I begin, I wanted to go over some definitions. First, a riparian corridor is an area that encompasses a stream or river or some type of waterway, and then also its surrounding areas. So this includes the banks of that waterway, the floodplain, and even the plant and animal interactions that are occurring in that area. And so then riparian ecology is the study of all of these aspects of a riparian corridor. So riparian corridors are very complex for a variety of reasons. One way that makes them complex is how hard it is to define the borders of the system. One scientist may say that the border ends at the stream bank, but another might say that the borders are an entire watershed. I believe that both are correct, but it really is depending on what you want to study. So if you want to study just like a specific area in a stream, then your borders are a lot smaller. But if you need to look at the entire landscape and how water moves through it, then you might need to look at that larger scale watershed. Another reason why they are so complex is because they are changing constantly. Especially here in the Pacific Northwest, we have very dry summers and very wet winters. And this means that the water reaches change almost daily. Um, they're not changing a lot, but it's enough to make a difference, I think. And then lastly, they're so complex just because of how many factors and living and non living things depend on them. And I'm going to go into more detail later on, but this are all the species that live in these areas, plant and animals. They also are helping regulate things like nutrient cycling and energy cycling through the environment. So in my presentation, I'm going to be talking about three main ways that riparian corridors are important and why riparian ecology is a very important subject to be studying. So the first one I'm going to talk about is how they affect ecosystem function. And so like I just said before, these are how it provides habitat for the living things in that area, and then also the regulatory services of nutrient cycles. The second one I'm going to talk about is the cultural importance of riparian corridors because they have a lot of significance for many of the indigenous people in the Pacific Northwest, and not only here, but over the entire country, if not the entire world. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about the human services that riparian corridors provide. So that's everything from recreation and sustenance, because we eat what comes out of the rivers and we drink the water, but then also how it's a major source of energy. So first, we're going to talk about ecosystem function. So I wanted to talk about some of the factors that are dependent on riparian corridors. So first I'm going to talk about the abiotic factors. So these are the non-living things. So there is hydrology, which is the way that water moves throughout a landscape. And it's not only water above ground, but it's also groundwater, which is very important when we're talking about like human civilizations. Another important abiotic factor is the soil health. And so these are things like pH of the soil, the salinity of the water will affect the soil health. And then the drainage of the soil is also very important to this plant species that are living there. And of course, there's so many other aspects of soil health, but these are just some of the main ones that I could think of. Um, Another way, just like hydrology, is how riparian corridors shape stream channels and then subsequently their floodplains, which are very important when we're thinking about ecosystems as a whole. And also, riparian corridors affect nutrient input and output into the terrestrial environment because nutrients will move through in the water and then get dumped out on the banks or in the floodplain to be soaked into the soil. We're also going to be talking about water quality. That's a big one. That's very obvious. And then how the role that riparian corridors play in processing pollutants from mostly human civilization. So that is fertilizers from agriculture farms and then runoff from cities, things like that. So on the biotic side, the riparian corridors are providing habitat and food for the plants and animals that live there. Just listed a couple there: fish, invertebrates, and then vegetation. But this also includes mammals and birds and just everything that depends on them. And so then this in turn leads to regulation of the food chain. And in healthy riparian corridors, it has been seen that biodiversity increases, leading to more species there. So, this one study that I looked at was looking at some streams in Pennsylvania and in Maryland. And they wanted to see how deforestation of the riparian zones affect the health of the stream and then therefore the ecosystem, because the stream is a good indicator of ecosystem health. And they just kind of wanted to see how interrelated these things were, because a lot of people would argue that the trees don't really affect what's happening in the stream, but these people wanted to study it. So they looked at a few different aspects of stream health. So things like stream bed roughness, that is an important factor of reducing the velocity of the stream because it allows the stream to slow down, it drops off sediments, and that just allows for a healthier stream. Another one is nutrient uptake of nitrogen and phosphorus, pesticide and insecticide concentrations, dissolved organic matter, dissolved oxygen levels, which are important for fish and macroinvertebrates. At higher levels, it means the water is colder and it is better for those species that live in the water. And then they also just looked at the population numbers of those macroinvertebrates in the fish. So the results of their study was that in the areas that haven't been deforested, they had wider stream channels, they had lower water velocity, higher bed roughness, more nutrient uptake, which wasn't because the stream was healthier, they found, but was because the stream channel was wider, there was more area for nutrient uptake. Rather than the skinny stream channels that were occurring in the areas that had been deforested. There was also more large organic matter. So these are, like leaves that fall in, branches, and those are really important for stream health as well. They provide different habitats for the invertebrates and the fish that live there. And in areas that are deforested, they don't have that as much. And then they also found that in the forested areas there was higher levels of macroinvertebrates. So basically this study found that the fragmentation of the landscape, so when a area is deforested, it has led to fragmentation of the streams. And so the floodplain doesn't reach as far, which has very detrimental implications to how the forest works around the stream. And so this basically means that the deforestation of riparian corridors affect the entire ecosystem integrity and then is decreasing all of those ecosystem functions that I mentioned before. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the cultural importance of riparian corridors. So you might be wondering, like, what does this have to do with ecology? And I think it's a very important aspect, actually. In the world of ecology and restoration, conservation, there's basically like two schools of thought when we're talking about Western ecological knowledge, which is WEK, and then traditional ecological knowledge, which is TEK. So traditional ecological knowledge is the way that indigenous peoples have cared for our natural resources for thousands of years before colonizers reached North America. TEK encompasses so much more than WEK, and it looks at it looks at the history of the site, and it looks at the ecosystem as a whole rather than WEK, which is a very like basic understanding and usually is focusing on one species or one habitat and not looking at the ecosystem as a whole. I think it's very important to note here that it's necessary to have both of these schools of thought when we're trying to plan for restoration and conservation of these areas. But right now, most of our plans are only based off of Western ecological knowledge, and it's really lacking, and it's just not. So I found this study on the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta in California. So here's a little map if you're not familiar. Like it's around San Francisco and the San Francisco Bay, and then it goes inland a ways. And so this area has always been occupied by First Nations tribes. It's estimated that at least 5,000 years, if not longer, until colonizers came to the United States and started expanding westward. So now this area is one of the most densely populated areas in the country, and everybody that lives there depends on this watershed. And it's really struggling because of the management style that has really only focused on Western ecological knowledge and not taking into account anything that Native Americans used to do and how they managed the land for thousands of years before we even got here. So these researchers wanted to look at how traditional ecological knowledge could be brought into the restoration plans of this area because what they were doing was failing and they needed a way to turn it around. So one plan was to reinstate planned burning around the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta. Planned or prescribed burning is really the way or the reason that our landscape looks the way that it does now, because the many Native American tribes use this so often and it has so many benefits. Some of those benefits here are listed. So they allow for the opening up of woodlands, and this will in turn increase biodiversity because it allows for the colonization of native plants and native animals to come in, because now there's room for them to grow and they're not being shaded out by big trees and fast-growing grasses. Another reason that are so beneficial is that they decrease evapotranspiration, which is water in soil that's being, or the water that's in soil that's being evaporated. And it also reduced flood flows, which allowed for less runoff and less soil into the waterways. And then it extended the stream flow into the wet season when it wasn't raining as much in California. So here's just a picture of what a prescribed burn looks like. This picture actually is from California. Another important thing that they do is they decrease the chance of the devastating wildfires that occur there, that are wiping out entire ecosystems and even urban areas. So this could be a really beneficial way to help the riparian corridor of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. Okay, so lastly, we're going to talk about the human services that riparian corridors provide. So many of the services that it provide for us are recreation, boating and whitewater rafting on the rivers, hiking in the areas along the rivers, wildlife viewing, bird watching, all that fun stuff. Fishing and hunting and foraging I added here at the end because not only are these recreational for some people, but they're also necessary for survival. So I added a few pictures here. We have some mushrooms that people have hunted, fun whitewater rafting, and then some fishing on the Columbia River. So then one of the main things that riparian corridors provide to us is hydropower. Hydropower is our main source of electricity in the Pacific Northwest. And I know this is a very controversial subject right now because dams can lead to disruptions in the ecosystem and the functions of those riparian corridors. So they disrupt fish migrations and really flood out the areas above them. One of the most famous examples in Oregon was, we'll just go back to a few slides. I have a picture. This picture right here was the Celilo Falls fishing. It's outside of the Dalles in Oregon, right on the Columbia River. And it used to be this great hub for fishing, and Native Americans would build their platforms out there and catch huge amounts of fish. And so when the Dalles Dam was built, this area had been flooded out, and the falls are no longer visible. They're underneath so much water that they can't even fish there anymore. And so yes, these things are terrible, but the functions of the dam are also very beneficial to us because it is a clean way to produce energy with little carbon emissions. And so this is a great way to produce energy until our world can be more reliant on solar and wind power, because we're still not producing as many carbon emissions. So in conclusion, I think that riparian ecology is a subject that must be studied further. This is a extremely important subject, and because it encompasses so many aspects of the landscape that people really rely on. And also people may not realize that the health of these systems really have an effect on the well-being of those species that live there, but also us humans. And then also, I think that it's important to involve traditional ecological knowledge into new management efforts so we're able to preserve these ecosystems and the benefits that riparian corridors offer for generations to come. Thank you.